Amy Swear, Senior Legal Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation, joins me now. Amy, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And that's an incredible breakdown that you wrote. Any of our viewers can find it on the Daily Signal or on Heritage Foundation. Talk to me about how this case ought to be prosecuted.
Well, I think you covered it fairly well there. At the end of the day, I think it's hard. First of all, I think it's hard to watch the video. But second, I think even watching that, assuming all of the facts in this officer's favor, assuming that he had reason to believe at first, look, I need to restrain this guy in handcuffs on the ground. He's resisting arrest. At a certain point, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what the facts were prior to that. At a certain point, when the man underneath you is no longer conscious and no longer breathing, you have to realize that your knee on his neck is actually causing him serious physical injury. You have to think to yourself, I really need to take my knee off of his neck. And to watch that video for minute after minute after minute, I think it's almost roughly 4 minutes from when George Floyd becomes unresponsive to when that knee is finally taken off his neck. To watch that, I don't think anybody can reasonably say, yeah, this was a reasonable, lawful use of this type of force.
And I mean, it makes you sick to your stomach to watch this video. I mean, this man's life was taken from him needlessly, even if he had committed the crime, even if he had resisted arrest originally. The point that you're making is, I think, the pertinent point that when he's unconscious, he's no longer posing that threat. And therefore, what caused him to go unconscious should not be continued after that point. Otherwise, for what purpose are you doing that? And that is being negligent of this individual's life. Talk to me a little bit about the state statutes, because you say, of course, a police officer is justified to use even deadly force at certain points, but the way that this is investigated is they don't just look at it from the police officer's perspective as that person. They look at it as a reasonable officer. You use this phrase in your article, too, because it means, would all police officers in this same scenario believe it was reasonable to act in this way? How will they go about investigating this?
Well, I think, in terms of investigation, I think they're probably right now waiting for the coroner's report to come out to make sure that there isn't some sort of weird underlying scenario where this man would have died regardless of anything the officer did. But I think the interesting thing about this is that even though we like to give officers the benefit of the doubt before rushing to judgment, which I think is the correct thing to do, in this case, we have on video exactly what happened. We have all of the relevant facts right there in front of us. And what they show is very clearly a use of force that isn't justified, because, again, you can see the man become unconscious. And so what they're going to sort of look at here is, one, was this a training technique that he was taught? And it looks like this was not a authorized type of technique. And regardless, even, as I say in the article, even if it's some sort of technique he felt compelled to use under the circumstances, again, at a certain point when he is unconscious, there is no reason for him to continue to suspect, man, I really need to drive my knee into this guy's neck, because he is literally, as a matter of fact, no longer resisting. And any type of force in that scenario is not justified.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting point, too. The mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, he specifically noted that this knee on the neck restraint is not one of the officially sanctioned techniques. Now, that doesn't mean a police officer can't use a non-sanctioned technique if the scene is calls for it, or if it's absolutely necessary, but there's no indication that it was in this scenario. Amy, talk to me about the Department of Justice as well, because the Trump administration has announced that the Department of Justice, Attorney General Barr, will now be investigating this. They actually called it a high priority to investigate the civil rights aspect or the racial element of this case as well. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So we've been talking so far about how he might be charged under Minnesota state law, but there are also federal statutes that make it a crime for law enforcement officers to deprive someone of their civil liberties in terms of what we call under color of law. That is, outside the scope of their duties, but, while still purporting themselves to be acting lawfully. So because George Floyd actually lost his life here, these types of civil rights violations carry very significant penalties that are, frankly, similar under federal law to what we would see under a second-degree murder conviction under Minnesota law. So he's looking at very, very serious possible criminal charges from the federal side of this as well.
And given the elements, and I know we don't have everything, we don't have all the details. We have this 4-minute videotape. We know for a fact that George Floyd is dead. We know what the police officer's claims are about what happened before the video. But given the elements that we know right now, what do you expect the Department of Justice to find? Do you expect them to levy federal charges against the officer?
Well, so in terms of what the feds might do, I think the feds might be waiting to see what Minnesota does. So they might defer to Minnesota here and let this play out under state law. But we could also see a case where if he's acquitted under state law, or if Minnesota does not take this to trial, that we could see the feds step in and say, OK, we're going to get justice under federal law. So that might be how this plays out. I don't see them trying to charge him or convict him at the same time. But it might be seen as sort of a fallback measure if these charges fall through or are not even charged at all under state law.
Right. And it'll be interesting to watch. I mean, there's no doubt in any reasonable person's mind. And in fact, there are some people trying to make this a partisan issue, but I haven't seen anyone on either side of the aisle justifying this death. In fact, I've seen people on both sides of the aisle, everybody on both sides of the aisle, condemning this death, as we ought to do when one of our fellow countrymen is unfairly targeted by the government and police as law enforcement are acting as an arm of the government. This death appears to be unjust, and his family and our country deserve justice. We deserve an investigation and a prosecution if that is warranted. Amy, thank you for laying out all the details of the legality of the thing in your piece. I really appreciate it.